Hello, everyone, and welcome to Eat Sleep Suplex Retweet. I'm Stephen Wilson, and tonight we have got the debut of a brand new show here on the podcast called ESSR and Friends. So, if you're watching us live on YouTube, thank you for tuning in. And of course, for those listening to us on the podcast feed, again, thanks for listening. I know we put out so much stuff, and you wonder, could they do any more? But we're trying to do a wee bit more with this show, where we are going to every week bring on a guest from somewhere in the wrestling media landscape and get them to talk about just how they got into wrestling and just discuss a few things in terms of what's going on in wrestling currently. Joining me on this first episode of this series, we have a man who is, I'd probably describe as one of the most influential voices these days in the UK wrestling scene, in good or bad ways, depending on who you ask. He is the host of the GRAPPL podcast. Is Benno. Benno, thank you for joining me. How are you?
Yeah, no problem. Yeah, it depends on who you ask. Basically, if you ask a wrestler, you're not going to get a good answer. But yeah, appreciate the intro, and yeah, I'm very proud to be your first guest on this. I know what it's like to do too many podcasts, so why not add an extra one in? That's my logic, and yeah, I'm glad you're of the same mind.
So you sometimes say the more wrestling content, the better. I mean, the more wrestling content comes out, like we're watching the TV, you're like, it's kind of it's always that balance with it, you know.
It
There's
is that.
obviously
Yeah.
so much stuff on it, but yeah, if you are watching us on YouTube, then please feel free to leave us a comment, and we will about anything. If you want to ask Benno something, we will ask of it. Obviously, it needs to be semi-nice, of course. And if you are listening to us on the podcast feed, please make sure you hit the subscribe button. If you are listening to us for the first time, you may be on this just to hear Benno, and you're stuck listening to me as well. So yeah, but if you do like what I say, subscribe button. We do lots of content here on the pod. So Benno, I like to ask this with anything I do when I get a new person on the pod, an interview, etc. And it's a simple thing because we've got probably some listeners, some viewers who are not maybe as familiar with yourself, don't really follow as much in the English scene. Just to really, how did you actually get into watching, enjoying, suffering at times this wacky world of wrestling, and what is it that makes you so passionate about it?
Yeah, I suppose for me, like if you're going back to the start, I'm old enough to have been around. Like I say, like the Hogan kind of boom period, but it's more in our country, at least I'd say in Europe in general. It was like that boom kind of went through to like 1992, SummerSlam '92. So I remember watching that on my mate's couch and learning about all the wrestlers and kind of being into it then. And I was that one kid in school who, when it got to like 1993, 1994, when everybody in my school dropped off, I was still watching. New Gen was my stuff, so watching through 95, 96, and then they all came crawling back. Attitude Era happened, and suddenly all the same people that didn't watch wrestling anymore did again. So yeah, kind of a bit of a lifer for that reason. Was a big fan of ROH in my older years. Somehow wound up doing a little bit of Brit Res for a very short stint, and that turned into a Brit Res podcast, and yeah, it kind of turned into what we did now. So the blame of it's probably lies somewhere in the middle of all that, but it's been a long stretch, mostly rewarding.
I found a lot of people liked it at primary school. And then when you got to high school, that's where you found the real hardcore fans. They were the ones who still kind of followed along, watched it. And then when you got to kind of university, college years, that's where you kind of rediscovered the people who were in the same state as yourself. And then that's obviously where the kind of passion comes from. Because I've got a couple of friends that I'm still really friends with that do the podcast with me and such for uni. And the main thing we kind of shared, the main reason we're probably still pals, is because of wrestling, which is crazy when you think
Funny
about it.
with me, it's like because of like being such a big fan of like I say, the bit of the doldrum years. My experience with kind of not having any like mates who like wrestling really, like one or two did, but generally speaking, nobody was into it. Aside from, like I say, when Steve Austin turns up and all of a sudden everyone likes wrestling for a very short period. But it's actually something that's happened more in my later life. Like I've made mates through work. Obviously, the lads I do the podcast with, and the lads I see around England who go into shows, at least in the peak of the Brit Res boom, became like my wrestling friends. But it was kind of, for me, it was like, where were you all when I was like, 12 and watching Shawn Michaels in 1996? What was going on? They all had better things to do, apparently, or they weren't hanging around with me. So yeah, it's kind of, mine's been like a more of a later life thing where I've actually discovered this subculture of wrestling fans.
Yeah, I was lucky enough. I was in primary school, peak Attitude Era. So obviously,
Right.
that's how you had so many kind of fans. Although a lot of the fans I had, a lot of friends with, didn't really watch Attitude Era. A lot of them were kind of ruthless aggression. They kind of got into it like
Okay.
school, early high school, which is something. But I've got two older cousins who absolutely did the podcast stuff for me as well. Absolutely love wrestling when they were a kid. They were 80s, that's kind of similar period to what you were talking about, and they would show me tapes. I would go to their house and they would have all the tapes that you got from like Blockbuster and stuff like that. So most people grew up like my age liking. I loved Austin, but most people would have Austin Rock. But I would talk about what about Randy Savage Ultimate Warrior WrestleMania when Miss Elizabeth was on the ground? It looked like
when you say that.
Park.
When you say that, I think I like my cousins because it was the same thing. Like I'd be getting tapes from them because, like, in those years in the early 90s at least, we didn't have Sky at home, so they'd be the ones taping stuff for us. And my older cousin John was the one who got me into it all. And yeah, that's kind of the same story as well. It's like Attitude Era that they're the ones that come back. I always think as well, like for us of a certain age, like I genuinely think like the Attitude Era, it's marketed as when things changed, it became more adult. Don't think it did. I think it still appealed to kids. It was just a dirty secret. Like we've been watching a lot of Attitude Era stuff or like early 2000 stuff on GRAPPL Patreon. I'm watching like 2001 stuff with 2024 eyes is quite eye-opening at times. And it's like, a lot of stuff with the women there as an age well. And you go back a little bit further, all the DX stuff and all of that. But I think about it, it's like, no, that was perfect for me. I mean, my mates were like 12, 13. We were the real target demo. They could lie to us and pretend it was for adults, but that just made us like it more, It was almost like it grew up with us.
Yeah, definitely. And as you mentioned, as obviously we've talked about, you've went on a journey with the whole getting into the whole podcasting world. As somebody, I've done it for 7 years. I did student radio or something like that. It's a difficult slog, but you guys have obviously kind of with GRAPPL. I know you did some stuff before GRAPPL and that, but you have kind of worked your ways up into the world where you've got the podcast there. You're doing some stuff on YouTube. You mentioned the Patreon stuff is really growing leaps and bounds. I kind of had a look the other day about your numbers on Patreon, which is for a UK Patreon site is quite impressive for wrestling. You're looking kind of the likes of Sean Ross Sapp and stuff in America as the kind of big names, but you guys put a decent number up, and you are at a point where you're running live shows around about massive events. How did you get to doing the podcast side of things from being a fan?
Yeah, well, for me, like I said, I did a little bit of I trained to wrestle in Wigan in about 2006, 2007. Had a handful of matches. They weren't good. Please don't look them up. But it kind of that kind of got me from being a fan into maybe the wrestling world a little bit, and then obviously took a step back, and then I was writing a lot of stuff. I was doing stuff for Indie Corner. I was sending reports through to PW Torch when things were starting to boom a little bit over here in the 2010s. So that kind of just naturally lent itself. It was Martin Bushby, used to be my co-host on the it ended up being the British Wrestling Experience, was British Audio Wrestling on the Law, and then Post Wrestling. I think he just read one of my write-ups on, I think it would have been Indie Corner, or it might have been one of the Torch ones, and just thought, I'll ask him on. I'll see if he fancies doing the show. And it was weird because I was around that same time, I was in pretty much the same dead end job I'm in now, but a little bit worse. And I was sat in the office listening to one of my mates from back when I used to wrestle, Sam Bailey, I think he was on Jim Smallman's podcast. And the idea just popped in my head. I was like, I'm doing a lot of this writing and stuff, and obviously, I became a bit of a knobhead on Twitter. I was going to say name on Twitter, but that sounds too strong. I was just prominent on Twitter, involved in a lot of discussion and kind of analysis in that way, as well as, writing stuff. And the thought literally popped into my head, maybe I should speak to a couple of mates, sort of podcast out. And then just while I was literally thinking that, Martin sent me a DM going, I've got this. I'd never spoken to him before, never met him. Just going, do you fancy coming on? It was called the PW Catchcast at the Timers podcast. So I came on that, caught the bug right away. Because I've been writing for Indie Corner, I did a couple of their podcasts, and that turned into doing stuff with JP, who I still do GRAPPL with now, and Joe at the time, who was a big character back then. And yeah, we kind of rode the Brit Res boom really until the wheels pretty much fell off. And yeah, we kind of evolved over time really from that into what we are now.
How did you guys, obviously you mentioned that point, the 2020 was a rough year for everybody, regardless of what it is. But from a wrestling podcaster, it was particularly tough. COVID kind of shut our scene down, and we obviously had speaking out after that point. And I really found looking from doing it from my side of things and looking at how our audience was reacting, the kind of appetite for fan-led podcasts was not the same as it was a year before. How did you guys kind of adapt to that one? Because obviously you had a bit more, your scene down south is a lot more healthy than ours. I could say it. I used to be one of the voices up here 5 years ago that said, no, our scene's healthy. Now I'm going to be like, no, it's shockingly bad. But how did you guys kind of adapt to it? Because I particularly found it a real struggle and still do kind of 4 years on.
Yeah, I think for us it kind of turned into. It was funny right at the time of the pandemic. Like I went to WXW in Germany. Last trip I've ever done was 5 years ago now. Crazy, but like we were over there as it was hitting, and it was like, is this COVID thing real? Not too sure. For like the last like stand, like it was like, I'm not sure we should be here. And then a week after we got back, like lockdown hit. And I remember on that trip speaking to a lot of people because we've been floating the idea of launching a Patreon. And it was okay, we're going to do it this kind of spring, summer, kind of sound the people out. What you think? And then it hit, and it was like, well, we can't do it now. Like everyone's struggling. People are struggling for money. It doesn't seem like the right time to do it. Is the appetite there? So we kind of parked that, and we turned our main feed, which was mostly still BritRes at that point in Europe, but it had turned into a little bit. We did a little bit of New Japan. We'd done a bit of more indie stuff at that point as well, and we kind of just did a bit more retro stuff during that period, did a few like flashback reviews of pay-per-views and got a bit of a taste for that. Those pandemic era Dynamites really kind of got us through as a weekly wrestling podcast, talking like the world of wrestling, like having those as at least there's one show a week we can kind of talk about and break down. That helped us as well. And it goes both ways. I think a lot of that stuff got us through the pandemic. It gave us like my social life was doing the podcast. It was like, well, we could at least I can have a chat with my mates there once a week on a Tuesday, or whatever it was. So that kind of got us through that physical part of it, and then coming out of it, I think we pretty much moved on from being like even a part-time British wrestling podcast at that point. Obviously, AEW was in full swing, and there was more of an appetite for that. So it kind of happened naturally. But it's funny you say that about our Patreon now, and like I'm to say, we've got a bit of a hardcore base. It's all those same people who were kind of with us in the trenches in the 2016, 2017 period when things were really great on this side of the world. And it's those same kind of fans, but I'm not sure the appetite's so much there to talk that stuff anymore. It's certainly not necessarily there for us to watch it anymore, but luckily they followed us along into AEW, and we do a bit more WWE stuff than we ever have before now as well.
Yeah, I think we had a point where I think between 2017, 2019, early 2020, going to the wrestling shows, ICWs was like a social event. I mean, some of the wrestling, looking back on it, was not brilliant. It was some really bad stuff if you kind of look back. But you were there, you were in the crowds. I mean, two of the best nights I've experienced as a fan was going to the Shug House Party shows at ICW ran, where they did Grado came back in one of them where Jeff Jarrett brought him out. There was stuff like that. And these nights, these kind of nights, you kind of think, I mean, if you actually look back and watch the wrestling and things, it wasn't great, but it was the social aspect, and you obviously met people and the podcast fed into that. And I think because ICW took such a massive kind of downward turn, that kind of negative effect, and so many of the people who were coming along with the ride, as you mentioned with yourselves, obviously I kind of just fell off completely because that kind of social aspect there. So it just shows the great part of having such kind of fans who are kind of loyal to you and kind of stick with you. We still have a lot of them, kind of granted, but they're kind of not as like frequent as they once were to get them back into it. Obviously, it's not the thing, but I saw quite firsthand, obviously not from a close scene, but from a short distance, just how loyal your fans are, because you've got the live shows, and you did that one at kind of Wembley where I was in the bar bit next door. Guys, we were quite keen on doing the West Ham thing and stuff like that, but we kind of got there and kind of seen what you guys were doing. We were tourists, we had to settle with some sort of wrestling. But just seeing the crowd that you guys had on that was fantastic. And then you had a run in from the biggest wrestler arguably on the planet. I just remember him standing next to me. Standing just not too far away from me, just waiting on a buzzer for his food. And all of a sudden, he just does a sprint. So
you saw it firsthand, did you? Okay, I've not heard the other side of the story.
He was standing, that bit of Hackney Bridge. Yeah. So you come in the door and there's the vegan, or is it the vegan burger place? You know,
Yeah,
the
yeah,
veggie
yeah.
burger
I
place.
walked through there.
Yeah. I thought it looked quite nice, then realised it was not meat. And then he's just kind of standing there. And I'm like that to somebody. So Osprey. He's just kind of casually just standing there. And then I think about 5 to, I'm kind of stunned. It's like, should we talk to him? One of the guys eventually catches him around the bar. And then I think I think it's Matty that came in for you
Matty,
guys. I literally, from a distance, you probably you would tell me otherwise, but see from a distance, I thought he was he was booked for you guys because he
Oh,
kind of
right,
came in as
okay.
if he was looking for him, and then just seen the two of them just run, and then obviously I've seen all the stuff on your socials, I've seen the thing over there that was just like
That's
that is
brilliant. Oh,
absolutely mad.
so what happened was, like, I mean, I'd seen at some points, like, we've had, obviously, as I said at the top, we've had a mixed reputation with British wrestlers over time. We've had run-ins with Ospreay himself, to be honest, at times too. But I'd seen in, like, on our YouTube, like, the Will Ospreay YouTube account followed us, and I was like, that's weird. That can't be a coincidence. And then, like, we just wanted a feeling. I'm sure he's out there listening, but we weren't certain. And then, yeah, it wasn't planned at all. We were just in the middle of the show on the stage. And then I think he walked past, like, the door where people came in and out of our bit, and he just must have poked his head in. I think he knew we were on. I'm not 100% on it, but I think he did. And obviously our audience went crazy. Our show went off the rails at that point, and then it turned into, go on, Matty, go try and get him. Because if anyone listens to our podcast, if anyone's going to go and try and track down Will Ospreay, it was Matty. And then, yeah, Matty disappeared for a while. So you're filling in the blank there for me on what happened at that point. Apparently went up to Will Ospreay and was like, Will Ospreay, and Will Ospreay went, Matty Edwards. So at that point, we knew, Matty knew he was on board. Dragged him back in, and yeah, he came on stage for a little bit, and yeah, it was just absolutely surreal. We didn't have him for long, but it was just funny. He was referencing things we'd said on the podcast, and obviously making a bit of a game of, like, I've heard the things you've been saying about me, because we're not always the most positive podcast either. But it was great because those shows are really, made up of the people turned up, but they're so nerve-wracking doing those things, just being on stage. I'm an IT trainer in my full-time job, so I'm not unused to speaking in front of people, but it's still different when it's 100 to a couple of hundred people we've had at some of our shows before. So him walking in just broke the ice massively. It didn't matter what we said before or after. Will Ospreay turned up, so everybody who came had a good time. So absolutely insane, really. So yeah, made up that happen. But that's so funny that you saw Matty coming out completely unplanned. Just it's Matty being Matty. It's what he does. He's the wrestler whisperer among us.
I like that we caught it by about a couple of minutes. We were very, very close to. I had to convince the guys I was going with to because I in my head I was like, the guys are there. It's across. We obviously we had one guy there who was from London. One of our guys, Matt Smith, he was kind of a tour guide for the kind of weekend.
Oh yeah.
And my cousin who does work in London, but we hadn't really been in that area, so we were just trying to figure out who we were. That's why we thought we'll go to West Ham because across the road.
Yeah, right there.
This is a pub with places to eat, like right across for the copper box. It was like, it's great. But then literally he's kind of there, and he walks. He kind of walked around the bar towards the bar bit. I think that's where I might get a selfie with him. I'll DM you the selfie because I think I've still got it later on. And then obviously Matty came round and he just seen the two of them running. And I was like to my mate, I was like, I think he's a surprise guest for that podcast. Obviously not knowing that
a lot of people thought that.
What was going on.
It's crazy. I got it, like, I haven't said it before on here, but we got like a nice DM from him the next day, kind of saying that, I know he's critical of me, but I kind of appreciate it. I listen to the podcast in the gym, some stuff like that, which is just mind blowing. This is the best wrestler in the world on the morning of a Wembley show. I'm sat in a fucking travel lodge bed near the copper box, kind of like, what is going on? What is this world? So yeah, it absolutely made it, really. It was so fucking cool. But yeah, there you go. That's the other side of the story. After that, I'll tell the lads that on the next podcast. Wish we had some footage of Matty doing that negotiation, but yeah,
it was very quick by all things considered from this point of view. It was literally done. I think he was worried because obviously he was waiting on his buzzer. I think his buzzer went off and he came back in. So if he didn't catch him soon, he was going to get his food and he was away across the road. So
it made the day massively. Broke the ice, and it just meant once that was done, it was like, right to the bar. We had a few beers and were able to enjoy the weekend. Unlike last year. Last year we did our live show on the day of the Wembley show, and it was just stressful. It wasn't a fun day, if I'm honest. So yeah, that just made it more of a party then afterwards.
I thought it was a kind of before we start actually talking about some stuff in wrestling. This is kind of a good feedway on it. I thought this year's kind of weekend, because we last year came down on the Saturday And it was kind of a bit, it was rushing about, and a couple of guys are like, I don't really want to do all wrestling. But whereas this year we thought we'll come down on the Friday and we'll make a bit of a weekend of it. And it was a bit of a running joke between us. One of my mates who was meant to go got married last week, and he kept talking about his stag do, and he was like, I'm going to make my stag do London, and never came. So we made it a running joke. This was his stag, to a point that we were getting messages going. There's no pictures of the stag in any of your pictures. It's like, because he's up in Lenzie somewhere. But I just thought the whole vibe of the weekend. I mean, you go to a lot more stuff down there than I do, and you can kind of get more of a feel. But I just thought the whole vibe between Rev Pro, you know, we part of us regretted. We were on the fence about going to Grado's thing, and then the next day we were kind of like, regret going to Grado's, but all the things about Wembley. I thought it was a lot more of a feel to it than last year, and than anything else, because I don't think it was as stressful. Because as I said, you guys had that thing cramped in the one day. Because I think I looked into going to your thing that day, and it was kind of like I was just trying to figure out buses, and I was like, this is gonna be crazy.
Remember you mentioning?
Well, this one, it was literally you guys were across the road from Copper Box, and it was an easy sell if people wanted to go there.
Yeah, it's funny. I think for me personally, we planned it better this year, at least for our personal weekend. Same thing, kind of spaced it out a little bit so that we could actually enjoy London. If I'm honest, saying that, maybe last year I did a little bit more like Londony touristy stuff, but as far as like the weekend, yeah, it just felt like more like not a full Mania weekend, but having the Copper Box show the night before, having All In, having like stuff like our show, and I went to the What Culture Lads live podcast as well. Just felt like a fun weekend. All In just felt, and almost felt like the pressure was off with, you know, last year being such an amazing attendance, but you know, the build was something we were very critical of in our podcast, and we had a bit of a ill feeling towards the build to that. I think that was better this year. The show felt, despite there being less people there, felt better this year. It felt more of a celebration. There was just a lighter mood to it all. Can't quite put my finger on why, but very much, I definitely have been in the same boat. I enjoyed this year a lot more than last.
Yeah, I think a big thing for us was we found a B&B that was close to a Witherspoons. That was just close to Wembley, but slightly outside of main London enough that the prices were really good.
Oh, nice, good tip.
So
I booked. I'd recommend next time they announce, book there's a premiere in near Wembley. We were there. We didn't have a Wetherspoons over the road, but you can get it cheap if you book it in advance. That helped too, being close, you know.
Yeah, our one was like 2 stops on the tube, so it was on the Jubilee line, so we could get in and out of main London and stuff like that. My cousin tells me, because I used to be a researcher at my job, it was like it really came in handy for the first time in my life that you did that job. I was doing that. But you obviously touched upon the kind of build to Wembley, which will be a good way to kind of feed into some of the stuff about actual wrestling that I'd like to talk to you about, and AEW and the whole influence, or how they're doing in terms of the UK audience, because you guys, rightfully, I kind of liked what you guys did last year about the coverage of the. I think we talked about it in messages at points last year about how we were saying, like, there was so many people in the States who were talking about this build, and they were like, yeah, but they need to do this and they need to do that. And I talked about that. Well, a lot of the guys in my podcast, their podcast said the same, that this build could end up being disastrous for them down the line. Do you think they're feeling that they felt the effects? You know, and obviously they've got Forbidden Door next year. Do you think that the way they booked that first show, especially now the way WWE's kind of starting to come up to it, was a bit of a low blow, a bit of an own goal type thing?
I'd say so, to an extent. Obviously, it's not the number this year. We kept kind of trying to repeat it on our podcast because I think what you're alluding to there, we had the Yanks coming for us. It was the same last year because we were quite negative on the build to All In, and a lot of I think obviously people like you guys get it, and people on our side of the world get it. But it just felt like the American podcasters and the American people talking about wrestling just didn't understand what Wembley is and what Wembley means, and that it's a gigantic. Like I heard one of the podcasters talking about it, like it's referred to as well, it's kind of like a Saudi show, and it's like you're gonna get a shock when you show that footage and you see how many people are in Wembley last year. Like that is not a Saudi show. That is your WrestleMania. That is your biggest show of the year. And it didn't feel like that at all until the night last time. And I think maybe that woke some people up at AEW. And you're right, maybe it was realized too late because you go round to this year, and obviously still, like I say, got to keep saying it, gigantic success this year. Still, anything in that 50,000 range is insane, especially compared to the numbers AEW do elsewhere at this point. It is less. Maybe part of it's the build, but I think being fair, I think a lot of it's probably just the fact that it's a cooler product, that it's the second time, so there's always going to be a bit of a dip there. Like you mentioned, the WWE factor. They're in Manchester, I think that they are tonight at time of
Yeah,
recording.
Manchester, yeah.
You know, sold that place out pretty much despite insane ticket prices. It's the hot ticket right now. WWE is the cool thing. Like it was like this year when AEW did that. It was Cardiff, wasn't it, where they did
Yeah.
Dynamite in Collision, and that the amount of seats, I can't remember how many it was. It was not more than a couple thousand, was it? And they were struggling to just sell all those tickets. And a year ago, that wouldn't have been a thing. That would have been snapped up in a weekend. So there's a clear weakening at a time when WWE is getting stronger. And I think it's just, a combination of a lot of things that just AEW doesn't feel like the hot, cool thing that it did at the start of the All In build last year that could definitely be taken more advantage of.
Yeah, I think you guys also talked about this last year, which I think was a good point. That the first, I think it was JP that mentioned it on one of your podcasts last year, that they made the right move in only doing Wembley last year because it kind of made the whole first UK show feel big on that stage. However, from this year, a lot of our guys kind of talked about how they maybe should have took advantage of more stuff, especially because they've got so many shows, Friday, Saturday, Thursday. And the fact that they made the decision to run Cardiff, which for anybody in the UK knows, it's a pain in the backside to get to at times from anywhere. I had to go do a work training day in Cardiff and I had to fly to, a barrier. I had to fly. At that point, I was able to fly to Cardiff and get the train up. But when I went down for Clash, I had to go to Bristol and then get the bus for Bristol. And that's from Glasgow, which is one of the main hubs, But you've got London there, it's a hub, and you've got so many shows. They had to rely essentially on RevPro kind of feeding as a sort of like de facto NXT during the takeover peak time. My idea. Do you think with something, even if it was just Rampage Collision being taped the day before, do you think that would have been a different? Yeah, they've got so much product in there. Do you think that was a missed opportunity itself there too?
I think so, yeah. And like you mentioned JP saying there, I think a talking point he had was, arena tour. You've done the stadium now. Let's just cover the country. Let's do what TNA used to do when they'd come over and, there'd be a show in Glasgow, there'd be a show in Manchester, there'd be a show in London, and they'd all do brilliantly. And it was like, you could do that, but on a bigger scale with AEW going forward. So maybe that's the answer. Because it's only going to go one way now, isn't it? I mean, it's a good thing that they're skipping, All In the UK next year, because I think that number would have been down again. And obviously, if you get 35,000 people or in Wembley, that's still a lot of people, but it's going to start detracting from the atmosphere and it's going to start looking bad as well as they hit it this year. That metric's only going in one direction. So I kind of get doing it one more time, but I think going forward, I think it's going to have to be arenas or maybe smaller stadiums. Maybe Craven Cottage becomes a factor, something like that. Maybe knowing Tony Khan, he likes his traditions and he's going to find it hard to give up Wembley. But by the time they come back to do another All In 2026, are they going to be a Wembley-sized promotion? If we're all honest with ourselves, maybe not. They could still come over and do a gigantic number. But I think the days of are they going to do 80,000? Are they going to do 90,000? They're very much in the past. Like I think even the most hardcore AEW fans wouldn't deny that.
Yeah, we compared it to on a smaller scale. Obviously, when ICW did the Hydro up here, the first one they did 6,000. Then it went down to about 4,000, and the last one was just horribly booked to the point where barely MD was in the actual seats above the ground, which was just.
Who did Red Lightning turn against that year to set up a war over the ownership of ICW? I felt like they did that every year. Like, who really runs ICW?
He came back.
I hated it.
He just came back. He came back. I don't obviously go to much of the shows anymore, but he came back on a show. We're in 2024, and he came back to align himself with Jack Jester, who's got a match at the big Fear and Loathing show, which is at the garage now, which is a big. Wow, it's quite a downturn just to let you from a Scotland point of view. And it's taking on Kenny Williams. So that's the state of what that's going on with that one. But you talk about tours, these. Obviously, they're doing Forbidden Door next year. It's not going to be in Wembley. I personally, if I don't know what you think, that there's a potential chance if they try to do Wembley again, WWE might jump the queue. But if they decide to run it at one of the kind of arenas close by, they've got a couple of choices, which is a good idea. Could you see them doing some sort of? Could you see the tour being done next year? If it's going to be something because I think there's a potential opportunity to at least, they could do You know, they could do Dynamite in Manchester, they could do Rampage, you know, in
Yeah,
Birmingham or something like that. They'll give kind of guys a bit more of an opportunity to do that than go into the Forbidden Door and kind of pique a bit of interest in, for the people who can't go down, because it's obviously not going to be as many tickets on sale for this show as it was. Give
course,
them a
yeah.
chance to actually experience the show, and maybe that would help, you know, build a presentation, because I sometimes feel like outside of a certain audience in the UK, the presentation is not quite as it should be.
No. Though the presence over here isn't what it should be. Like I said, I think TNA did a better job of like being almost the UK promotion. There was a point where on our old podcast we were talking about that.
Yeah,
But
TNA tour last year was much better. I think much better organised from a going around
yeah,
the place type of thing than AEW was.
I think they always like even going, you know, for me going back historically to like, you know, the period when they were coming over and doing big arenas, they just kind of got it. And there was a point where we were talking about, oh, they could come over and do like a European tour for 3 months and get like half a year's worth of input tapings done. They didn't do it, but the opportunity was there for them. So yeah, I'd say for AEW, as crowds dwindle in the US, and we saw that horrendous number for Dynamite last week, you know, 2,000 odd, which is indie numbers pretty much, you know. We've both been to British wrestling shows that have eclipsed that number multiple times over. You mentioned the Hydro, and obviously big shows over here in England for Progress and the like. They should take advantage of it, and I think you're absolutely right that there's no stadium to jeopardize if it were like. So it's let's say they run the O2, it's a lot less tickets to sell. It's a smaller arena. You're not going to be kind of, you know, hitting yourself by running all the tapings around it, by, like you say, doing a collision if Rampage still exists, doing something like that, doing an ROH show if ROH ever becomes a thing, and even doing, yeah, a Dynamite, like you say, up maybe in Scotland, maybe in Manchester, but somewhere far away from London. I think it's a gimme to do that, and you could maybe do that in 2025 and then 2026 when maybe they try and do a stadium again, no matter how big. Maybe you do just isolate it to the stadium then, but and try and do the smaller tour next year and just see how that works out, because it might be a better idea.
Yeah, definitely. I think it would work so much better on that one. I think it would help the presentation. But
yeah,
as you say, Tony Khan is very rigid in his ways. He likes to have the kind of tradition.
yeah.
Double or Nothing and All Out are classic examples why they've never tried to move either of those two.
The
I
Labor
think
Day weekend for Double or Nothing, yeah, which is crazy. Like when I went to Double or Nothing a couple of years ago and it was in Vegas, and it's like it's a big bank holiday weekend to the Americans. So it's like on the one hand, good for people traveling, but then on the other hand, prices for everything goes up. And they've hit the last couple of years going to Vegas haven't done as well. I know WWE are going to Vegas, aren't they, for Mania next year? And they're probably going to eat AEW's lunch. Will Tony Khan have to change his plan, which he hates doing? He probably will have to. It seems to be when he's forced to, then he's like willing to kind of mess around with the calendar. But AEW's biggest problem right now, I think, for me, is perception. They've got a perception issue. They don't feel hot. They don't feel like a cool thing to watch. And I think rowdy European crowds would at least help with that, rather than some of the dim arenas we're seeing them in at the minute.
Yeah, I kind of, there's a perception that they kind of, if they ran smaller arenas in America, they would look a lot better. But I think, in fact, Arthur Ashe is a great example. The first time they ran Arthur Ashe looked amazing. They had the headline match of Danielson and Kenny Omega, which you know sold itself. It looked absolutely fantastic. It was the whole idea of that historic tennis, you know, venue holding stuff like that. But then they ran it this year, and you were kind of like, it was a bit forced, in a way. And I've even heard people, I don't know if you've seen this, people kind of saying maybe if they could, they'd be better off flipping to be like, they could just be like a pay-per-view company and they would still do well, because every single one of the pay-per-views are fine, but it seems to be sometimes the week to weeks just kind of stumble at points.
TV, you know? Yeah, it's like those run-of-the-mill TVs just aren't a hot ticket right now, whereas maybe it's the fact that the pay-per-views, you know, like you say, on my podcast, we might criticize elements of them, but they're largely good. You know, they're largely consistent. It's rare that AEW has an off night on pay-per-view. I think that's what it is. Like, they can still sell 6,000-7,000 tickets for a pay-per-view because people know they're guaranteed. No matter how good or bad the booking is in the build to the pay-per-view, that incredible all-timer roster is going to give you a great one-night show at a pay-per-view. Maybe that's less guaranteed on a Dynamite night, but I was the same with you. Like Grand Slam this year, my girlfriend went and like she was in the media section, and like she was posting pictures. It was just embarrassing, like the gigantic amount of empty seats in there. And it was like, why would you even be there unless it was say it was Forbidden Door this year they did there, that would make sense. I think a lot of people were thinking that was going to be the case. But like for the run of the real Dynamite, they are not a company that can run an Arthur Ashe anymore. It's just, it looks, like you say, looks terrible. You'd be better in a dingy, tiny arena that looks packed with, fans who are happy to be there. And that's the biggest thing for me. It's not just a game of WrestleNomics and a game of numbers and a game of like, oh, look at this sliding scale on a spreadsheet. It's affecting the shows. You see it in nights like last week's Tuesday Dynamite, when it's those echoey, cavernous arenas. It hurts the product on screen that you're watching, and that's the biggest issue for me.
Oh, totally. I know with pay-per-views, the one thing I'm always really critical of, and sometimes I feel like I'm being too critical and people think I'm just moaning, is always the build. In fact, there's always something with the build. Like I was talking about Wrestle Dream last week, and I don't know what your thoughts are on this one. Willow Nightingale was fighting for the women's world title, but she lost to Statlander. But Statlander was fighting for the other title.
Yeah.
And then don't get me started on the whole thing about Statlander turning, because I had an argument with some guy on Twitter about it. I was like, he was trying to like, Statlander said she's moved away from Stokely. I'm like, yeah, but why?
Yeah. It punishes. It's like old school WWE, 10 years ago.
Exactly.
Or maybe 4 years ago. Punished for being invested, aren't you? For following along and believing in these characters. You're not. And the thing about AEW is you're always rewarded by paying that amount of detail. Yeah, that was a mess because, like you say, like they flipped on, who won the feud ending match. And not only that, like the Dynamite before, I heard Joe Lanza on Voices of Wrestling. She got a title shot. She's never won a match. She has never in her entire AEW career won a singles match. It's just like, surely somebody should have like a story. You don't have to, it doesn't have to be like, rankings or wins and losses don't need to be exact, but somebody somewhere should have that stat and go, yeah, probably should give her some wins before we put her in that match. Or we should probably be thinking about who's going to be the big contender, at least at the pay-per-view next month, and slot things the month before. And that's, I think, what slipped in this period for this last pay-per-view. It just didn't feel like a month ago they really knew what the matches were going to be for the pay-per-view, and everything's coming together last minute, and things like that are kind of what happens.
Oh, definitely. Talking about things in AEW that's maybe slipped under the radar a bit, I'm going to talk to something that's maybe a bit close to your heart, and it might hurt you to maybe talk about it a wee bit, because I know how much you love the classic days of Ring of Honor, back in the 2000s. What's your feelings on it now? Do you feel like Tony Khan should have bought it and then just used it for the video library, or do you think there's still an opportunity to maybe do something with it? I mean, I have not watched any of the Thursday night shows because I don't really feel like it's kind of pushed. I feel like it's very random that the Ring of Honor guys, some are on TV, some are not. I spoke the other day about Mark Briscoe's on TV all the time, but Athena has not been on AWTV for 2 years. This seems a bit scattered. I mean, I don't know what your thoughts are on that. For me, thoughts, obviously, such a Ring of Honor fan.
Definitely, yeah. It was big part of like I used to go to Ring of Honor shows in America quite regularly in the 2000s. It was a big thing for me. I love ROH. Reason I've got the belt behind me there. Massively passionate about it. And when Tony Khan bought it, it was like Punk said, I think when he was sat at the presser next to him, it's like, oh, I'm glad it's in Tony Khan's hands and not Vince McMahon's. Don't know whether, I think he'd probably still stand by that, but maybe not so much.
Yeah,
but like that's how I felt at the time, and it was like, oh, this is somebody who clearly was one of us. He was probably on the ROH message boards. He was absolutely a fan, and you can tell that by some of the things he's booked in AEW. He's going to treat this with the respect it deserves. And to be fair, even at the time, I wasn't 100% on whether you'd bring it back as a promotion. Like we were like, well, could it be a t-shirt brand? No, that sounds a bit lame. Or could it be, could it be a feeder system? Could it be an NXT? That feels a bit lesser for the ROH brand, but that would make sense. Instead, it's not really, it doesn't save any masters, does it? It's we preview it on our weekend show on Thursdays and run through these cards, and they're just, like you say, completely random. That was another thing at one of the early presses. I think one of the journalists asked Tony Khan, are you going to be booking this, or are you going to be assigning it? So I was like, no, I'll book it. And I was like, when and how? Like, you're struggling to manage AEW TV. How are you going to manage this too? And whether it's him, at least in the early stages, trying to do too much, but then palming it off to people who maybe aren't the right people to palm it off to, has been a problem too. Either way, it's never gotten like the care or the importance placed on it. There's never been a clear line between, is this developmental or is it its own brand? Or make a choice, do the wrestlers appear both on AEW and ROH, and it's just AW's third show of the week, or does it have its own roster? They've never made that choice, and then it's just left without any identity whatsoever. And I'd struggle to think really whether you could bring it back. I think in theory you could have a secondary promotion that, you know, you send people down there 6 months at a time. Then you're strict with it. Maybe not now because he's got a bit going behind him. But like 6 months ago, you could have put a Daniel Garcia in there, made him your ROH champion, and made him the focus of those shows. And just seen what happened over 6 months. He might have developed a new character. He might have, you know, gotten better. There's other people like that you could do, maybe lower on the totem pole, but just pick some people, stick with them, put them there, and give it a purpose. But they didn't, and instead it's like this extra hour of TV that nobody watches because it's on a streaming service that nobody's got, takes place in front of fans who are literally leaving the arenas because they've been at a long Dynamite or Collision taping. And yeah, it's just not really for anybody. I don't really know why it exists at this point, you know, other than just the vanity of it, or just because, like we said, Tony Khan likes his traditions and likes, you know, he has ROH, so he continues to make ROH TV, even if it doesn't really mean anything at this point. So apart from the odd time, maybe when he's in potential TV negotiations and he decides to include Chris Jericho in one of the world title program, which seems to be what's happened recently. It's just a mess. It really is, and it's hard for me to say that as a big ROH fan back in the day, but it's definitely not my ROH that exists right now.
Yeah, I kind of feel. I think a great example of what you were saying. I seen someone who follows it more than me. I do. Posting on Twitter last week, it was like they booked Atlantis Jr. versus Brian Cage on the pay-per-view, and I have absolutely no idea why they've done that.
Yeah.
So if you follow it that much, I think that's, if you think that, then that's a bad sign. I think we see with these big wrestling promotions, any kind of key thing, any kind of nail in the coffin tends to be when there's no TV deal. We saw that with WCW all those years ago. The TV deal was nail in their coffin. And I think if the continuation is there, that it's not going to get any form of TV deal, then I don't particularly see the point. I don't think many people, you could probably say Athena has kind of benefited from it in a way, but at the same time, she's been there for like 2 years. She's not fully made that transition to AEW TV, which they could probably do with her on that roster. You kind of feel like it needs to be something. There needs to be some sort of middle jumping point, because if you've got these guys who are doing great work, then what's the point in it if there's not going to be any transition? And you've got guys who are maybe doing the kind of crossover thing like a Mark Briscoe. Shouldn't Mark Briscoe just be an AEW wrestler as opposed to being someone who's a Ring of Honor wrestler who's on AEW? Because he's on AEW every week, maybe 2 or 3 times a week.
And he takes losses, like the Jericho one's the only example I can think of recently where they've gone, oh, that makes actually he's lost here, so we probably should do something with the ROH belt. But it puts you in an awkward position because he's the champion of your other company, and that's like the catch-22, isn't it? It's like, for me, I just wouldn't leave Athena on her own. She's one of the only people who is ROH exclusive. They're not really doing that with the men's roster. They're just doing that with her. So like, yeah, you know, either make that decision and you've got an entire roster that's there, maybe for a period of time, and then you can move up, or make it, you know, you go back and forth and you find some other way of making it make sense. But instead, the mushy middle they've got is like, she's the one person who's constantly on ROH TV. Mark Briscoe is never on ROH TV other than maybe odd occasions. And yeah, they just haven't really managed to thread that needle or make it make any sense, because most of the ROH guys on ROH TV, the other problem is when they're on AEW TV, they're losing because the jobbers to the stars on AEW. So again, even if that's your exposure on AEW TV, why would that make you tune into ROH? Why would that make you pay for Honor Club?
Yeah, no, definitely. I just kind of, I think what Punk said when you mentioned that was right. I think kind of, I think if it went to Vince, I think the thing would have just, I don't know what would have happened to it, but I'm worried about it if it went to Vince. There's obviously
a documentary. That'd be about it, I think.
Yeah, I think the thing that Danielson said recently when he was talking about Vince being asked about the G1, and Vince said, I'll let you work the G1. And he's like, I'm not fully sure of you what the G1 was. But I just kind of feel like there'd be something similar with ROH, and that would maybe use it for some footage, it'd be that, but I don't even know how it would fit in the network. So I do think it was a good move that Tony bought it, even if it was just to get that kind of all-in name, the all-in footage, so to say.
Yeah.
But it's just, I think they should. I know he's he's clearly a proud man, which is clearly what I kind of think about. He's confident in what he is for a guy who's clearly a big nerd. But I think he should just cut it. I mean, the whole stuff with the TV deal now is a great chance for us to go, right, let's kind of put it aside. We tried, it's not worked. Let's get all these, let's keep who we've got, and then maybe bring Dark back and usually get some guys like that for Dark. But I just don't know. I think it's going to turn it. If it keeps it going for too long, it's a danger of kind of tarnishing the kind of parts of the legacy it had. I mean, is that quote famously from the Dark Knight? You could die a hero or live long enough to see yourself become the villain. And I'm worried that's potentially what could happen with ROH if it keeps plodding along.
Definitely, and that's the problem for me. A lot of it is that it's that legacy of ROH. Even if you go back to like the retro stuff, have they made the most of that? No. Like, if it had gone to WWE, I think exactly that. It would have been documentary fodder. It wouldn't have been an active promotion. Arguably, that might be better because at least you keep the old stuff intact. And I'd have to think they do more with that classic library that AEW hasn't done. Maybe it becomes part of one of these TV deals coming up, or maybe it's part of some streaming service going forward, and it just lives there instead. But yeah, it limping along is helping nobody.
No, definitely, and I just I'm not infused by it in any particular point. I was not being infused for Rampage for a long enough. And they're obviously that's potentially getting killed off. So part of me feels like they really just need to streamline the TV in some sort of way. But at the same time, I think the worry is if you streamline it too much when you've got that TV deal, then it's hard to get the happy medium. And I think, but I just don't think Ring of Honor has any fit in any sort of medium. I just think it's if Rampage is cannon fodder, then surely Ring of Honor's got to be now.
Absolutely. Yeah, that's it. And it fell into that. It's not even AEW Dark at this point. Maybe they'll bring that back. Maybe that's what it could be. Could be YouTube content. Maybe you could go in that way instead. And that I'd at least had an audience. At least people were seeing it if you were going to use it for developing younger wrestlers and giving them reps. But yeah, the way it is right now just doesn't suit anyone.
Yeah, definitely. You spoke earlier on about how you've kind of, as a podcast, started doing a little more in the realms of WWE in the last couple of years than you had done previously. I remember when I first listened to you guys, you were very much Benno has got some difficulties with his camera. He'll be back with us momentarily, and we'll get back into that conversation again. If you are watching and listening to us, of course, please make sure you hit the subscribe button, and you can catch all of our content. I say if you are watching us on YouTube, feel free to leave us a comment while we wait on Benno returning. As he's had just a bit of issues with his camera. He will be back with us momentarily, hopefully. So if obviously just to fill the gap, he is back. He's back now. He should be back now.
There you go. Sorry.
And he's back. No problem. I filled a bit of air with some chat there, but it's all good.
StreamYard being StreamYard. My apologies.
It's not a problem. I was just talking about the WWE side of things there. Obviously, as a podcast, you'd mentioned how you had done a lot of WWE stuff for a long time. I remember when I first listened to you guys, you were very much the anti-WWE stuff. You would rightfully at points, I think. Looking back now, a lot of the stuff you said is quite rightfully because the product wasn't great. But I think a lot of it, maybe you brought on Matty, who is a very much. I have a lot of WWE marks on my other podcasts, but he is very much a WWE guy. I think it's fair to say. But I think I feel like with a lot of the rest of you guys that are on the podcast, yourself, Gareth, JP, I've talked a bit more positively about aspects of the product, and I do think it does show in a way that if you put out good content, people will talk about you positively. And I know it's been 2 years now since the whole Triple H came in, where Vince initially stepped down. That's a completely different podcast itself, talking about Vince. We could be here all night. But in terms of actually current WWE, what's been your thoughts on that whole transition over the last couple of years? Do you think it was intentionally potentially a slow build into what we've seen in 2024, or do you feel like it was just just teetering issues and getting himself under his feet a wee bit?
Yeah, I think it's a bit of mixture of both. I mean, I'd say first off, everybody should have a Matty in their life, because me and him used to argue about it back when it was bad, and we did a Shane McMahon deep cut this week for our Patreon, where we went through Shane's entire career. and it was a lot of fun in the 90s and the early 2000s.
Yeah.
And then we got to the comeback, and then we got into like there was booking from 2019 when it was just like that happened. Really, him and the Miz with a tag team. I feel like I've rubbed that from my memory. There were just loads of shite, and just watching that era of WWE, watching Roman Reigns flounder when you know what you know now and how great his presentation is now. I was actually arguing again with Matty. I was like, Matty, if we're all honest, in 2019 you were defending this to me too. Do you now admit it was a bit shit? And he kind of half admitted it, but he wouldn't fully admit it and go with it. But you know that's a big thing for me. Like having someone like Matty, and I know you with your guys. Like I think you've got to be able to recognize it when it does change, because there are people out there who are stuck in the mud who are just like, no, it's the same as it ever was. It hasn't improved at all. It's still that shiny WWE crap, and it's like no. Someone just sit you down and make you watch a 2019 Raw, and you will figure out that things have definitely changed. And it's just, I think there's definitely a degree of like storyboarding and just general, I think, competence. There's no Vince McMahon there to like AEW right now. Tony Khan turns up to Dynamite and makes all those plans last minute. That doesn't feel like it's happening in WWE. And I think that's happened over a period of time. We saw it with Paul Levesque in NXT. It wasn't always massively entertaining television, but it was functional television. Stories moved along at a good clip to, good takeovers, that 5-match formula that he's kept now. And I think he's just took a lot of that just basic competency and just applied it to his booking it in main roster. So I think that's changed. And I think just in general, there's a less of a, I don't know how you put it with Vince McMahon. There's a bit of a contempt, I think, for the audience. They'll take anything. I'll force John Cena down your throats. I'll force Roman Reigns down your throats. This is what you actually want. And really, it was about what he wanted. Whereas it feels like in this Paul Levesque era, the reason people like Matty and hardcore WWE fans are really, really back on board and in arenas up and down the country this week is because there's baby faces that you can like. Baby faces aren't made to look stupid. There was periods where there was just like not really many likable top level baby faces in WWE. Now you can pick out 5, 6, 7, 8 of them. You can think of characters people are invested in when it comes to your Jey Usos and your Judgment Days and obviously the Bloodline and Cody and all of that stuff there. And yeah, it's all kind of rewarding those fans for watching it. They're no longer punished for watching it. They're rewarded for liking their favorites. And it's just overwhelmingly a much more likable, competent place, to the point where you rightly say someone like me who's, maybe more hardwired to prefer an AEW product and kind of look down on a WWE. I think you've got to call a spade. And when you watch it, it is just a better, more functional product with, even the wrestling's got better, I feel like, on some of the shows, and the stuff like Punk and Drew this month is something that wouldn't have happened in Vince McMahon WWE. I think all of those little improvements have just snowballed to where it's kind of the feel good promotion right now, in a way where AEW kind of feels like the feel bad promotion for better or worse.
Yeah, I mean, they made a homemade bracelet, the most treasured prize in the whole of wrestling. That's.
Don't get me wrong, I hated that. I absolutely hated that. But I get what I get. People like
it got a bit. It's like I kind of liked the bit of Hell in a Cell when he puts the beads in his mouth type thing. I quite like that. But I think some of the points.
I pretended I didn't see that.
It's like, come on, man, you've got the match won. He's wearing your bracelet. Get over it. But the babyface thing is really interesting, because could you have imagined maybe 6, 7 years ago that Punishment Martinez was one of the biggest baby faces in wrestling?
It's insane, isn't it? Even Jey Uso, we've argued about that on my podcast. I don't see him as a main eventer, but how over is he? Like, I was watching footage of him tonight in Manchester, the chants and all of that, the Yeet stuff, and you can't move. When they were in Liverpool on Monday, couldn't move for Yeet t-shirts knocking around the city centre. It's just, there's a feel-good thing going on with characters like that you wouldn't have expected to be in those slots. And then a lot of people you would, Sami Zayn is a big part of like the boom. Vince McMahon booked him as a heel for 5 years. He spent 5 years of his prime as a heel, and it's not even like he did necessarily bad work during that period. There were good things he did individually, but like just tapping into that is a big thing. And tapping into obviously Cody and bringing him over has been a big thing, and just giving the fans what they want a little bit, I think just obviously makes sense, doesn't it? And it's worked in spades.
It's because you look at that kind of the War Games match last year. I think that was a great example. You had Randy, who just came back. Obviously, he was going to get a pop. You had Seth. You had Sami Zayn. was Cody in the match? I can't remember. Drew.
Yeah.
No, not Drew. Sorry, Jay. And you could
Mm.
argue that every single one of them was
Mm.
over as in, which
Yeah.
is crazy when you talk about all those years ago where they tried to book John Cena and he went down your throat, Roman Reigns down your throat, even guys like Seth Rollins. Seth Rollins kind of looked like a massive face, and they buggered him up by putting him in that kind of red light Hell in a Cell 5 years ago.
Oh,
type
God,
thing,
yeah.
you know. It's just a complete. I think a lot of the stuff Vince booked, when he booked good baby faces, I think sometimes, as it's been mentioned so many times, he was kind of forced into doing it. You know, Bryan Danielson's a great example of it. If Vince had his way, you know, he'd have still been put in some sort of undercard match against, I don't know, the Adam Rose and the Rosebuds or something like that. But his hands kind of forced on that. But now, I think the thing I seen about Triple H, he's tapped in. He goes on Twitter during shows, which I think, obviously, you would see a lot of stuff that's not good to see. People like, well, you're too safe, you don't book the women's division right, type aspect of it. But I think it's good signs, and it's crazy where things have been as a wrestling fan, that you see a camera pan from backstage to the ring in one shot, and you talk about giving it an Oscar. It's just like, that's mental when you consider, like, because the amount of stuff that has to. I'm sure you've probably seen it as well. There was a rumor that Vince McMahon was hiring Kevin Dunn to do his response to the Netflix doc. It was like, please do that, because that would be the most comic thing in the world. Like, camera cuts between every point of his face, but it just shows just how much we've suffered as fans.
Yeah.
I think that's why we were craving for, like, near enough a decade and a half for something like AEW. And I do think, as much as they maybe not acknowledge it, it's a good thing for them because it's pushed them.
Yeah, that period where things were really rough in WWE, it gave birth to a lot of things. Like, it allowed NXT to feel like an alternative, even though WWE owned it. It allowed New Japan to kind of be an alternative for fans, and then it allowed, the birth of AEW. And like that, there isn't really that's the thing. There's still a demand for an alternative for WWE, but you have to be honest with yourself and go, is that demand as strong when WWE is more competent? And that, you say things there like the camera stuff and just the general production changes that have happened, they're not reinventing the atom. There's still things about the presentation I really don't like. This Raw this week was extremely taped and canned, and they used a lot of that hairdryer noise they used to use on SmackDown for fake pops, and there's elements of it I still don't like, but a lot of it has been stripped back, and they have been trying new things and just doing the basics right. And that's where you get pushed back on the other side. You get like a lot of our audience, I think we built it over years, are more likely to like an AEW than they are to agree with a Matty and like WWE. And they're going to push back, and they're going to, well, it's not really, like I said earlier, it's not really that different. It's still that shiny WWE. Or you're all doing somersaults because they're telling very, very basic stories. But that's all it's really took, just to at least put things right and just improve the mood around the place. And like I say, those ones among at least my community are probably going to be hard pressed to change their mind, because unfortunately they won't tune into Raw when it's Drew McIntyre cutting a great promo, or it's Gunther having a cracking match, or even a Sheamus or somebody. They're the ones who will turn the channel on. It'll be R-Truth still there on TV stinking her up, and they'll be like, see, it's still the same. But I think those of us who are a little bit more open-minded and willing to watch the totality of it have to admit, I think Raw's, I said it on our podcast last week, I thought I'd get more blowback for it, has been a better show than Dynamite recently. SmackDown, I wouldn't argue that in general, but I think Raw has, and that's a sentence I would never have said 2 years ago, 3 years ago, and I'm further back than that.
What's your thoughts on NXT these days?
Not for me. I see why it exists. I see why it's for certain people, but I think it's that's one where it's like there's a hard, like, I think yourself, like, from doing this stuff, there's a line between, I think, if you don't like something, a lot of fans, like, I used to get this from Matty, if you don't like it, don't watch. So I wouldn't watch, and then I'd have an opinion on something and go, well, you're not watching, so how can you have opinion? So you can't win. And with NXT, I'm kind of in that boat. I don't like it, so I don't watch, but I try and keep up to date with everything that's going on there. But if it does feel like a show that's it's got a good USP. It's there clearly to target to a younger audience. How much of a younger audience watch it compared to Raw and SmackDown is up for debate. But there's a clear attempt, at least, for it to be like a younger show that appeals to younger people. They do a job with the women's division there as well. Everything's just a bit too shiny, and like I say, probably a bit too young for me for it to appeal to me. But like from a business point of view, look at the numbers of that. Look at how much that's improved, and obviously moving on to, onto the what's they call terrestrial TV over there. It's not network, is it? Is it network TV? That it's on now.
Cable TV or something.
Yeah, it's weird over there. Their TV
Yeah,
system. Their equivalent to terrestrial is what it's on now, and like the numbers have gone up for that reason, but they've gone up over time. It competes with Dynamite now because they've invested in youth and give it, at least unlike ROH, a reason to exist. Whether it ends up being a product that's for me or not. That's just a fancy way of saying no. I think it's shit, but I can recognize why it works.
I'll give my thoughts on it. I don't know. I see how you think about it. You've obviously had the period you mentioned, the black and gold one, where it was the super indie. So you had all the guys like Adam Cole was coming in, Samoa Joe was coming in, all these guys were great. But I thought if you watched week on week NXT TV at that point, it was rotten. It was really, it was not good. But you'd watch a takeover. I would watch takeovers and have barely a clue what was going on TV. I just thought that looks great. And I'd absolutely enjoy what was going on. They made the move to 2.0, and obviously people like yourself would switch them off for a good reason, because it was the shiny, happy thing. This was meant to be the gritty show where all these was, and they were bringing all these guys in, and especially in the first 6 months of it, they were literally bringing person after person after person after person after person, and they still do to an extent. I'm sure Brian Alvarez had a joke about they do these backstage segments with 19 blondes and you don't know any of their names, which I get it. I watched it. They did the first show on CW, and I thought, they've stopped doing that. And then last night they did it again. I was like, all right, fair enough. But I feel like they're starting to become a bit more of a hybrid show. I think a part of that's probably down to Shawn Michaels on there, because Shawn Michaels knows both aspects of that game very well. Not many people know that aspect better. And you're getting a point where you're getting solid wrestling matches in there at points. The takeover shows, they're not as good as they were on the day, but you get some good stuff in there. But I feel like you've got a mixture, especially coming up now, there's a mixture of all these people coming through, the homegrown stars. You've got your Tiffany Strattons, your Braun Breakers, your Obafemis. Tony D'Angelo is not for everybody, but I love the guy. I just don't know, I just really love it. And then they're bringing in the indie guys again, which is good. Julia, Stephanie Vaquer. There's talk of Jordan Grace's contract running out in the TNA at the start of next year. I think she'll be in TNA. She'll be in NXT probably. And that's Delta, likes of that. There's some juggernaut, indie guys coming through into that one there. So I feel like that's kind of what they're playing into, which I think would help a bit more as an overall product for WWE, whereas the previous NXT would have catered to that audience that went to AEW. And then obviously that meant that when people went to the main roster, so many of them floundered in the Vince era.
It was great for us. It was great for the Smarky Old Men demo. We were loving it, but it wasn't. Whatever we thought of Vince McMahon's WWE at that period, the two sides clearly weren't communicating with each other, because it was polishing up these big indie names, and then main roster WWE was anything but. And I think absolutely agree. I think it's better now than it was in the NXT 2.0 period. Absolutely more watchable. But at least the benefit of the NXT 2.0 period, as much as it hurt the product, at least it felt like there was, okay, we're going to, it is a real feeder league. We're going to develop people that at least might get used on main roster TV, whether that was the right plan or the wrong plan. And then now in its current iteration, I think it's at its best point in that, it's doing more things. It's bringing in guys from outside like an Ethan Page, and it was going to, most of the Machine Guns were going to go there, weren't they? But obviously that's their main roster now. But they are bringing in interesting people. I could have imagined that Daniel Garcia flourishing there and potentially getting better as a promo and the things that he's not as good at as he is in-ring wrestling. There's a bit of a purpose there, and because it's Shawn Michaels running it and him and Triple H, thick as thieves, then there's that communication between the two sides. Shawn knows a bit more what Paul wants, and Paul kind of keeps in that, watches NXT, I think, is a minimum standard, which is something Vince never did in the past. So just from a purely, even if the end product isn't for me, from a promotional point of view and from a purpose point of view, it's a million miles away from what it was, and it's clearly working.
I mean, Triple H doesn't just watch NXT; he likes to show up. You know,
Yeah, and get his name on it at the end of the
it,
executive producer.
I love his booking, but he loves a vanity project. He just loves getting it. I criticise Tony Khan for it in the past, but the one thing I can at least say about Triple H is he knows how to go out there and cut a promo. Tony Khan does not know how to talk to an audience. I don't know if you were in Wembley at this point, but did you see live the Tony Khan Martha Hart thing in the arena?
Did, yeah, awful. Just, but it's like that every show because he's out there. He wants to scream. He doesn't seem to understand how microphones work. He just shouts into them, doesn't he? And it's just he's not a wrestler like Triple H of 30 years of 40 years of experience, whatever it is. He is just a promoter who shouldn't be out in front of the crowd. And that's the thing with Triple H for me. It's like fans like us. I think I'd guess you were the same. Like, remember, like the Forum era and like the early 2000s. The only man we possibly hated as much as Triple H was Jeff Jarrett, because it was like, oh, he's this political maneuver who's only out for himself. I love Jeff Jarrett now, don't get me wrong, but it's like, he was like this evil, like all the bad things about wrestling, and he's all about his own ego. I don't think none of that's changed, but I think having products that we all like and post nice things about on the internet feeds his ego in a different way. And is all his NXT favorites kind of, they might not have been wrestlers you would have thought Paul Levesque would have liked back in the day, but he recognizes that was his way to kind of get into the good graces of the fans, and they're like his avatar on screen, apart from, like you say, the many times he's on screen himself. And it's still feeding that same ego, but it's more of a force for good now than evil like it was years ago.
Yeah, it's not really a terror style aspect of it for sure. That's spot on with him and Jeff Jarrett, by the way. Another man who we talk about egos as well. The last kind of things we'll talk about, I'll give a good wee bit to talk about it, is he's a personal favourite of yours as well. CM Punk, of course, Mr. Brooks loves getting himself in the papers, getting himself in the news. It's been an eventful 3 years, I think, for him. I think we took that trip in the time machine again. When he came back on that rampage, could you have foreseen any possibility of what have happened in that time? And knowing what he's done in the past and his work of actually happening, could you have foreseen that kind of timeline?
When you think back, you think, yeah, CM Punk coming into a locker room and causing trouble and getting into a fight does actually sound plausible. Hindsight is 2020. At the time, probably not. Like at the time, I remember staying up specifically for that rampage. Steph interviewed Punk, I think, either that night or maybe it was a pay-per-view not long after that. And I remember just sitting there. She had him on like speakerphone while I was in the room, having to hold myself back from just going, "I love you, Phil," or something like that. I wouldn't have done it, but I was tempted. But like that whole period was like a fever dream. It was so perfect because it was CM Punk back in wrestling in a company that felt like old school ROH, that felt like the accumulation of that dream of the mid 2000s of Punk in that generation. So like at the time, I was drinking the Kool-Aid and was probably like, Punk's going to be here forever. This isn't going to be like WWE. He's going to have a great time with all his indie friends and everything's going to be all right. Maybe that opinion changed over time, Colt Cabana being present and the other things he ran into backstage. I'll tell you this, he was great podcast fodder. I think our top 10 ever listened to GRAPPL episodes all involved CM Punk getting into a fight or somebody biting somebody or anything to do with CM Punk is usually numbers. So yeah, as it went on, obviously that opinion changed, but yeah, I probably should have saw it coming, to be honest.
He blocked us on Twitter like in 2018. In 2018, but it was weird. We did a podcast profile on him. We were very, very positive on everything about him, and for some reason he blocked us. He still blocked us now. I don't understand why, but yeah.
I found Dax blocked me the other day. I was like, I didn't even know. I've never tweeted him. We've never interacted. He just must have come across one of my tweets and went dickhead and blocked me.
Seems like a guy in block wrestling podcast. But yeah, the whole thing, Punk, is just it's a bit mental because I remember that rampage quite well. It was quite a good point. It was the point where COVID was ending, but restrictions, so people were getting together. We had a big get together in this house to watch SummerSlam that weekend because we just bought the house. We bought the house like 9 months before, but couldn't have anybody over. And the whole we stuck the thing on, and it just felt like a changing of eras type thing. It helped, especially SummerSlam was a bit crap. But it just felt like this is a shoot in the arm. You then had Adam Cole, Bryan Danielson came back the next month, and it just felt like the whole thing was going to shift. And it's just amazing just how quickly like a man in his 40s like that could just snap and things like that. It was just, as you mentioned, it was a dream to be reporting about wrestling when this was going on, because it was just every week something was happening. It was it last summer, pretty much, when the Collision stuff was starting? I know you guys talked a lot about Collision because you were really big on the Collision stuff, but it was literally like, he doesn't want this person here, he doesn't want that person here. It's like,
schoolyard stuff, isn't it?
I know. I talked about because the other day, because it's there was the whole thing with Tony Khan and the Lucha Brothers, and he apparently wanted to cement his authority by keeping the Lucha Brothers contract going. It's like, you should have done that 2 years ago when all your big stars were having a scrap in the backstage locker room. It's just, I think it feels like a fever dream at points, because for him to do that, he was so vocally, I'm against going that place. That place is like hell. They treated me like hell. And to be in the point now where he pretty much seems like that, it seems like the next in line. It's kind of like Triple H, Shawn Michaels, probably Regal, and then him, which is, that's just does not feel real to me.
Which is funny because, like, I think when he came into WWE the first time, obviously big ROH fan myself, and I'd had interactions with him from going to those shows and such, and like everything about him and the way you read Triple H was, I just assumed they'd be the best friends, because it was like they're both snarky politicians who work a certain style. Who I think they're gonna get on. I think Punk's gonna be like a big star in WWE, and he obviously was, but of course the opposite happened, and they were probably too similar to get on. Whereas at this point in his career, obviously in different places in the life, and again, probably it's happened. It took a very long time to happen. Probably shouldn't be a surprise that CM Punk is a Paul Levesque type wrestler. But yeah, it's an insane story, because like I always think CM Punk's mostly driven by spite, and that's the impression I always get. And like I say, from those ROH days, I've got friends who are in or around them or in AEW kind of were saying, oh, Tony Khan needs to just get everybody in a room and sort this out. Like Punk has been, I think Bryan Danielson was maybe, I think I'd heard was the one who was trying to create like just a meeting between Punk, Kenny, and the Bucks, and the fact that they could never make that happen. That just CM Punk is absolutely the number one reason it all went off the boil. But as a boss, that Tony Khan just couldn't even get that far, especially with his EVPs. Like, surely for the good of the company, we can all get together and all resolve this. And who knows, with Punk, it might have still gone off the rails, and we might have still had, if we didn't get the All-In incident, we might have got a different incident. If we didn't get Brawl Out, it might have just been something else, a different week. But yeah, it felt like a manageable situation until it very clearly wasn't. And yeah, on the WWE side, I'm half surprised that it's worked as well as it has, and I mostly believe this whole company man shtick that he's doing. But a big part of me kind of just believes he's still the same old Phil Brooks. He's driven by grudge, and the grudge now is he can't let the AEW side know that anything is wrong. So he has to make this WWE run work. He has to make sure it's a success. He has to make sure he doesn't melt down, because that'll be proving the haters right if that happened again. And that's probably motivating him now to be the great upstanding employee he seems to be right now. But unbelievable, we are where we are.
There's an aspect of it, he's maybe trying a bit too hard, like he's going to NXT and he's giving pizzas out to fans in the parking lot type thing. It's like
a lot of pictures with the female roster. A bit too much.
He just loves Roxanne and Cora Jade. He just seems to everywhere they seem to be. He's there. It's like fair enough.
Constantly.
I don't.
And you
I don't
see
know
that.
Sorry, you go.
I was
it feels like he just wants to AJ. He just wants AJ there. Sorry.
And that would maybe resolve that. But I think as well, like it bleeds into his kind of television performances as well. Like I love the Hell in a Cell match. I don't think his promos have been great, but I don't think they were great at the end. It's still CM Punk cutting promos, so there's still the worst CM Punk promo is still very good, but they do feel a little bit stilted. They do feel a bit like he's coloring very much within the WWE lines, and like that's another sentence I never thought I'd say. I feel like Drew McIntyre carried the feud on the promo end. Punk carried the star power. Don't get me wrong, and was fantastic in the matches, but it does feel like there's something a little bit missing because he's being that kind of good employee, making sure he's not putting a foot wrong, doesn't want to prove the haters right. There's something to be said for off the boil CM Punk, who is a ticking time bomb, who is driven by grudge and does go off the rails at times. That kind of drives good wrestling TV at times as well. So it's a very different CM Punk we're seeing on screen, but yeah, I think he's gonna keep going because he doesn't want to prove anyone right.
What did you think about them showing the brawl out, the all in thing with Jack Perry on TV? What did you think of that as a business strategy? Because I thought it was a bit iffy.
Yeah, didn't age well. It's like at the time, it just felt low rent. And the caveat was, well, if it's going to get over this new cast of characters, it's going to get over Jack Perry, there's at least a positive to come out of, for me, what was still a negative. It made AW feel second rate and B level to show security cam footage from Wembley Stadium on the TV show. I think they had the pay-per-view to sell that weekend. They aired that instead. It was just, yeah, it felt AW were very much losing at that point in the public perception battle, and it made that worse. But at least you could say the positive is we've got a new heel in Jack Perry, and we've got this new Young Bucks outfit. But current state of play, Jack Perry has not really moved much along in things, despite being in a world title match last month. And the Young Bucks story that ballooned off it, and the Tony Khan Meltzer driver stuff, that kind of went to nowhere, didn't it? Outside the Christopher Daniels running out in an as the George shirt and tie and trying to break up stuff every now and then on a collision. That didn't really lead to anything. So was it worth it? I'd probably say no.
It's kind of like you get Punk, who's had that Hell in a Cell match, that well-reviewed Hell in a Cell match. You can say what you want about the bracelet stuff, but the feud was great between him and Drew. They did a great job making it. Well, as you have the Bucks and Jack Perry, who have brought Okada down to like the ground at points for the way they booked him on TV. It's just like
it's comedy mid-card now.
I know it doesn't get a match at the biggest one-on-one match at the biggest show of the year at Wembley, which is baffling. I'm not a massive Okada fan. People slag me for it. I don't know why. But even then, I can understand how big a star he is, and he'd be doing something with him. And
you haven't seen that on AWTV, have you? That's the thing. It's a thing they tell you for people, who were into that. People like me. I was watching New Japan and I was a fan of Prime Okada, but you don't see that on AWTV. You see a funny mid-card guy, and I don't really see where they're going to get their money back based on what they're allegedly paying him. It hasn't happened.
Yeah, you look at the free ones they brought in for that type of money. They're so much different. You got Ospreay, who's looked amazing. You got Okada, who's like there, and Monet, who's I just don't think it's worked at all for her at this point. It just does not look like a fit in that company. So for all that type of thing, you get and then you got Punk. It was kind of like, well, why do we need Punk when we've got all these guys coming in? It's like, well, Punk's still benefiting it, and you're kind of marauding along with these guys who have been paid, out of the back pocket type idea. I don't know if they've obviously been paid. Maybe Tony and his dad have hand paid for them, and it's just it's baffling in a way that they could do that, but it's a whole spiraling thing. It is soap opera that we were in a stadium at the same point watching a magnificent match between him and Joe. All of the view that 5 minutes before that he just lamped one of the guys one of the wee ball bags backstage,
which is hilarious as well. Just being there in the stadium and starting to see the tweets coming through and getting a couple of texts hang on, what's happened? Oh, fucking course he has. At the time, I desperately wanted to see the footage, just not on a Dynamite. But that's just Punk all over. He goes out there and works Samoa Joe of all people on a Wembley card, and that's the end where he goes out. And to your point about it feels like a bit like a Premier League team who lose the star striker. He's been problematic or whatever the issue is, and he's gone, and they spend the money on 3 big signings, and it's like you say, Ospreay done way better than any of us would have thought, especially coming along as a promo and an act, and however he is. Okada, not sure they're getting return on investment there. Mercedes, I'd like to see cut a good promo, and I'd like to see all of these Sasha stands that apparently exist on Twitter actually show up to the buildings or watch the show. I'm not sure that's working either. She feels out of place. I'm not sure it's been a great investment.
Yeah, you could even argue with it that a lot of people were talking about, well, we could lose them or lose the Elite, and the Elite are a long-term investment. But if you even look at the guys, Kenny Omega's been injured for 2 years. The Bucks, they wrestle good matches, but I don't think they do a lot of great stuff character-wise. And you could only argue Hangman Adam Page has started doing some great stuff with Swerve, but even then, he just lost to Jay White on pay-per-view. So where does it go from there? You know, it's kind of like your Premier League analogy is great. It reminds me of Tottenham when they sold Bale.
Right, yeah.
And they bought like 8-9 players. And you know, Ericsson was a success for Spurs. He could be Osprey.
Yeah.
That's the rest of it, you know?
Yeah, totally. And that's it. I think with the league comparison, it's a little bit closer because I think Hangman should be more than he is. He should be. Things like that Swerve feud should be stuff he's always involved in. He should be one of the main characters of AEW at all times. And it's so weird that he does disappear for these long periods all the time, doesn't he? You never know. He might not be on Dynamite now again for another 6 weeks. You never know with the way he's handled in the company. Kenny, yeah, I suppose you can't help the injuries, but yeah, if you ask me to trade for the Bucks, I'd send the Bucks packing tomorrow. That's going to come out in a few years. They're going to, once the AEW run finally ends, it'll be like, yeah, guys, we weren't that motivated, to be honest. And it was like, yeah, we can fucking tell. We all saw it, you know. Yeah. And even the people who are defending them now will have to admit that, like, this has not been, you know, a great run. They deserve all the credit in the world for starting AEW, and they're still dining on that, aren't they, to this day? But yeah, it's hardly been inspiring their run, especially since Punk left.
We've got loads of Buck haters here. Don't worry about it. It's just like
good man.
It's who's it they compare them with? I can't remember who they compare them with, but it's literally any time they wrestle a big match, we've got one of the guys here. It's just like I lose. I don't care. They're awful. They can't wrestle. They can't promo. I mean, it's just not there. I mean,
yeah,
it's kind of like
checked out.
Yeah, it's that aspect. Like, I think it's a different animal working indies to working weekly TV. There's some ones who just thrive on it. You can just tell that they enjoy doing it. I mean, we talked about Priest. I mean, Priest used his weekly stuff and it worked for him. He does a lot of stuff like that. I know he's not a great wrestler. Dominic Mysterio, you can tell he puts the graft in with that character because he's an absolute arsehole at times. Yeah. And it just works. But the Bucks, I mean, yeah, you could wrestle a great match. Meltzer will give you 5 stars. But at the end of the day, you know, you had the chance to make the biggest business feud potentially ever, and you blew it because of your egos. It's just I don't know. It's just something. I think there's a lot more, but I think they're going to come out not as good as Punk. I don't know about Kenny. Yeah, Kenny just seems like very chilled, but the Bucks, there's something with the Bucks there. I don't know. And you could tell the whole stuff where they were making fun of Punk as well when he left and that stuff. It's
definitely coming from them, wasn't it?
Yeah, it seems to be more for that side than anything else.
Yeah, and that's the thing. Like Kenny can always come back and have another great run on top. Problem with Kenny is like they'll end up putting him. He'll be teaming with the bloated corpse of Kota Ibushi again, and it'll just be like, oh well, okay. Kenny Omega's not quite doing what I want to see him to do in AEW, but it's still good. It's still good. He's still Kenny Omega. Bucks don't have that. They are coasting on a reputation on an indie run that was more than half a decade ago at this point, and it wasn't impossible. They could have been TV stars with a bit of effort and a bit of polish and a bit of just interest in making that tag division what they said it was going to be when they started AEW, but they haven't made that effort and they have just coasted. And yeah, they'd be two of the first off the door if I was booking AEW on a TW game, 100%.
Yeah, but obviously you're not trying to be pals with everybody like Tony Khan is. But last question I'll ask you just to kind of round off the show. It feeds back into Punk. There's a big rumor that he's going to be next in line to face Gunther at Survivor Series, which would be obviously a year for when he came back. Do you foresee him winning that title at all by the end of this year?
Yeah, I've not really thought of it because my just assumption was that he'll be, contender of the week. They'll have a fun match and then Gunther will move on. Because if it was me, and to be honest, if it's Triple H, like the way he seems to book, I think he'll want a long Gunther reign. And I think my sneaking suspicion would be if Punk's going to win the title, he wouldn't want it to be that one. Now, as far as getting his hands on the other one, that's obviously tied up with Cody, Roman, The Rock, whatever they're going to be doing with them over the next year or so. But my sneaking suspicion is I could just imagine Punk not wanting to be that, seen as that secondary world champion, and combine that with the fact that if it's not broke, don't fix it. Gunther is like a defending champion. I'd do that for another 18 months. I think he's just brilliant in that role. He makes belts, doesn't he? He's made this belt feel more important than it was when he got it. So it would seem soon, but also, yeah, I suppose you've got to navigate the waters of putting Gunther over Punk and finding a way to book that. But I think it's more likely than not that the Punk doesn't win.
Yeah, very interesting. I could foresee. I think I got a long Gunther run. would be fantastic. But obviously that will be up to Triple H at that particular point. On that, I do think that's a good time to kind of round off what has been this debut episode of ESSR and Friends. Of course, this is a running series that we're going to be doing going forward. So if you've enjoyed it, subscribe to YouTube, or if you're listening to on the podcast side, please hit the subscribe button on that. You can get all our content. We've got our news central shows that we put out every week. We've got our Saturday Draft Live show where we talk about our wrestling fantasy draft every week. So you can subscribe to catch that. Benno, before we finish off, could you let the listeners and the viewers know where they can find yourself, what you've got coming up on the podcast and such?
Yeah, definitely. Just search the word GRAPPL, no E, whatever podcast or so. We're on YouTube, so you can get video versions of Spotlight each week, which is our main flagship show where we kind of cover the world of wrestling, mainly AEW, bit of WWE thrown in, especially on pay-per-view weekends or whenever Matty's involved. But we try and cover the length and breadth of the wrestling world on that. That's usually out Sunday nights. We're trying a new schedule at the minute, but yeah, on our Patreon, which is patreon.com/GRAPPL, as well as our YouTube members page where we do podcasts pretty much feels like every day, but multiple times a week. Lots of bonus retro content. We just, like I say, did a Shane McMahon deep cut going back on the career of him. We just did the show on No Mercy 2001. We've got all kinds going, a lot of retro ROH content over there as well. We do weekend previews, stuff like that. So yeah, patreon.com/GRAPPL is probably the best place to catch all of our stuff. But if you search GRAPPL anywhere, you will find us.
Yeah, so between our two podcasts, you're pretty much covered for the full week. We'll have something at most days of the week, you know. I mean,
usually something, yeah.
I do one on a Saturday. Benno's got one out on a Sunday. We'll interchange during the week.
There you go.
Absolutely,
covers everything.
Lots of fun. But I hope you've enjoyed this first edition here of ESSR Friends. Benno, thanks for joining me again. I hope you have enjoyed being on with us.
Oh, it's been brilliant. Thank you. It's been great to just chat about wrestling in general. Honored to be the first guest, and yeah, up for doing it again at some point. It's been a lot of fun. Thank you.
Yes, I say we'll be doing this every week, so you can catch us here. I have been Stephen Wilson, and we'll see you next time. Have a good one.